All right, hope everybody's doing well. I've got a whole bunch of slides here, so we'll see how far we get with this travel through northern South America. Let me get over here so I can see. Last time I talked to you about Middle America, Mexico, and Central America, so we're going to move into the large continent of South America. And here you see the various countries. We have 3 sessions left. So I'll take three days, and today try to cover some of this area in the northwestern part of South America. And next time do the southern cone and maybe include something about Bolivia and Paraguay, but mainly Argentina and Chile. And then the final day we'll look at Brazil. Brazil encompasses about half of South America. Half the people in South America are Brazilian, speak Portuguese, and so we need to spend a good bit of time talking about that large area. Many different regions in Brazil, each one different, unique, different from each other. So today, this is the area we'll talk about. Basically 4 countries: Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, down this northwestern side. I'll give you a little bit of data here to begin with. I want you to make sure you write all this down. Talking about 4 countries, emphasize a couple of things. Ecuador is the smallest. Notice that the area is comparable among the other 3, but Ecuador is basically small. And for reference, Alabama, you can see, is about half the size of Ecuador. And that kind of gives you some basis, some idea of how big these countries are. If you look at the population now, this is ethnicity. Emphasize a couple of things. First of all, notice the population of Colombia is much larger than the others, 44 million people. Ecuador, a good bit smaller. The other 2 about the same, Peru and Venezuela. Notice, again, the ethnic component. Mestizo would be a mixture of white and the indigenous population. And so you see a substantial percentage in all of these countries that would fall into that category. Mulatto, blacks, and white mixture. Notice that Colombia and Venezuela have higher percentages than the other 2. And that's because they're on the Caribbean coastline. And so that influence from the Caribbean is spread down into this area. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then finally, of the indigenous population, substantial portions in Ecuador and Peru would call themselves indigenous, almost half in the country of Peru. So, and that would include some elements like speaking other languages other than Spanish as their primary language, some things like that. If you go back in history, this was before the independence movement. This was an area that was known as New Granada, part of the Spanish realm, north of the Peru, La Plata area, and then south of New Spain up to the north. I want to talk first of all, and then at some point I'll get back into this, it broke apart into 3 different countries: Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. Ecuador broke off later. Ecuador was an area that you might consider a forgotten region, an area that was of little interest to anybody at that time, and so that there was no desire for the larger areas, centers at Caracas or Bogota, to hold on to that region. We'll talk about Venezuela first. And this course is titled Experiencing Latin America. Experiences in Venezuela have been difficult lately. If you've been reading the news for the last few years, they are going through some very serious problems, political as well as economic. Get into that. But just a brief sort of rundown of the history of Venezuela. Columbus actually explored the coast here on his 3rd voyage. Didn't really establish any colonies, but he simply looked around and made some charts. As a fellow came along later, a few years later, and decided that the area looked somewhat like Venice. He saw indigenous people, Indians, living on houses on stilts along the coast and in this Lake Maracaibo area. And so he named it after Venice. So Venezuela is Little Venice, or that's what the origin is. For a long time, the region within the colonial period was of little interest, agricultural. You had farmers and a lot of eventually cattle herding, ranching in this area known as the Llanos. But the Spanish didn't find any mineral wealth in Venezuela. No silver deposits, no gold deposits to speak of. And so it was more of a backwater, an area that was neglected by the Spanish crown. It became important, though, in the early 1800s because one of the children of Venezuela decided he was done with Spain and wanted to declare independence from Spain, and so Bolivar then becomes one of the leaders, or the primary leader of the independence movement from Spain in the early 1800s. And the point that Rod made to me, and I want to emphasize to you, when we talk about the independence of the countries of Latin America from Spain, we're not talking about a social revolution of the lower class or most of the people. This was a breaking away of the aristocratic group in South America from the aristocrats in Spain. So for the ordinary people, not much changed, but it did mean that they were independent from Spain. Bolivar then amassed an army. He used the llaneros, these cowboy individuals, type individuals from the Llanos, put together an army, and after years of combat with the Spanish, ended up establishing independence for this whole northern area of South America. During the years since then, Venezuela has been ruled by alternating periods of democratically elected leaders, followed by dictators. I put a picture of Mr. Gomez here to remind me of several of these individuals. Gomez was one of the notorious autocrats of the early 20th century. And it just so happened that he was in charge at a time when they began to really develop oil production in Venezuela. International firms had come in, Royal Dutch Shell, Esso, other companies had come in and explored areas in Venezuela, discovered a lot of oil, and so he ended up personally benefiting from a lot of that. Later on in the mid-1900s, 1958 I think it was, Bittencourt was elected president and put his picture up there because he essentially implemented a new constitution that established independent democracy, democratic rule in Venezuela for many years and for a long time. In fact, when I first started teaching about Latin America, Venezuela was a shining light of democracy in the world. But of course, no longer. They have their share of political problems, and we'll talk about those. Petroleum intimately related to the history of Venezuela, and as you'll see as we go through, pick up on that. Notorious recent leaders, Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999. He was born working class, had a military career, officer, lower grade officer. I don't think he ever made general unless he decorated himself as general. Had an attempted failed coup in 92, ended up going to jail, coming out, gained popularity with the poor. His party finally elected, freely elected in 1998, and then through various devices established himself as equivalent of a dictator, permanent president. Very socialist, strong affinity for communist principles, ideologies, friends with Fidel Castro during this time, established the Bolivarian Alliance of Venezuela and other socialist groups within Latin America, and in particular Cuba. Of course, you may recall recently battle with cancer and eventually died in 2013. Well, at that time, this fellow comes to power. He was the vice president, Nicolas Maduro. Frankly, when it happened, I didn't expect him to survive politically, because he is not the charismatic leader that Chavez was. He doesn't really give a rousing speech, but he inherited the political party and the associations of Chavez. He was a bus driver early on, and the early Chavez supporter. Came up through Hugo's party and then served in Congress. Eventually was made foreign minister, though he knew absolutely nothing about foreign ministry. I could make a political comment on that, but I won't do that. Became vice president, and of course, when Chavez died, he took over. So he's been president since 2013, and his presidency associated with the decline in Venezuela, a lot of political problems and related economic problems, and ever-increasing oppression, restriction of all human rights, political rights, stacking the Congress, all those kind of things. Here you see Chavez with some of his cohorts, friends in Latin America. You can see Lugo from Uruguay, Evo Morales, who is no longer the president, but was for a long time in Ecuador. Brazil's Lula, who leader of the Labor Party in Brazil, and actually threatened with going to jail here recently. And let's see, Correa, who is from Ecuador and is no longer the president. Anyway, you can see demonstrations. Here he is with the two of them together. And then, of course, Maduro elected in 2013. Well, we'll come back to politics. Let me talk to you about the geography first of Venezuela. I wanted to point out, if you look at a map in Venezuela, of Venezuela, it will include all this area over here, that region. And that's country of Guyana. Well, Venezuela has always laid claim to this area, even though it was controlled by the British and today is independent. So they, it's part of their national honor that they still claim this eastern area. But basically you have four distinct areas. You have the north central highlands, the Llanos, the green area, a southern upland area, the highlands here in the south, and then the region around the Lake Maracaibo up here in the northwest. Perhaps in some ways the most important area is the region known as the north central highlands, and that's the Andes Mountains extend through North and South America, and they break apart here, and so you have some that go here west, but the primary range extends through the mountains here south of Lake Maracaibo. These are the Merida Mountains, and then along the north central coast of Venezuela, and structurally the Andes actually continue on out under the ocean here. Trinidad is physically part of the Andes chain, stretching on out this way. So here, of course, not nearly as elevated as other areas, but nevertheless structurally still part of that uplift associated with these relatively young mountains of the Andes. And this is important because it's where most of the people live. By far the majority of the population live in the north central highlands. You'll see, let me just point out on the map, capital city of Caracas, located here along this northern area, not on the coast. It's about 40 or 50 miles from the coast. And another important area that I'll mention is a lake region right in here around the city of Valencia. So these are important areas. And in addition, you have people living in the highlands over to the west. Caracas, a large city, metropolitan area, an attractive downtown area, also a lot of poverty in the surrounding region. And this is what Caracas has been associated with lately. Riots, disturbance, political unrest, and just in many ways an unsafe area to be in. I'm sure tourism has greatly dropped off to this area. This is the northern port city of La Guaira, and so if you go to Venezuela, chances are you'll land at the big airport here along the coast and then travel over the mountains 40, 50 miles. I don't think it's that long, 30, 40 miles to Caracas if you want to get to the capital. So here's the lake bed, Valencia. And this historically has been significant. Good soil around the lake And so it was an area where they raised crops, often to feed the cattle that was produced off in the llanos, but also for food. This was, during the colonial period, this was one of the more important areas in Venezuela, in this northern region. And it's still an agricultural area. The lake's heavily polluted. You can see the bloom, I guess, out on the lake from this image. Two cities flank the lake. One is Valencia, over here to the left, and the other is Maracay to the right. Both of them pretty good sized towns, significant populations, and a lot of the economic activity still associated with farming, agriculture here on this lake. There's not much oil in this region of Venezuela. A couple of pictures, you see various crops, sugarcane, corn, a variety of other grain crops produced in this area. And as you can see, pretty good size metropolitan area within this region. Over 1 million people in these cities. Another, as you go further to the west, you get into higher mountains. These are the Mérida Highlands. You can see the city of Mérida located right there within this upland area. And as you can see, they become quite significant. In the rest of these countries that we'll be talking about, the Andes play a very important role in terms of blocking transportation, communication among the areas, controlling where people live, that sort of thing. Not as important in Venezuela. These are the only really high mountains in Venezuela. And they grow a lot of these cherries on a cherry tree, right? You know what that is? Coffee. So, grow a lot of coffee. Coffee is typically grown in highland areas and tropical regions. One is that for coffee to mature correctly, it needs to have a cool climate, but it can't tolerate freezing temperatures. And so ideal conditions are highland areas where you have constant cool temperatures, but you're not subject to frost as you would find in temperate continental climate areas. And so that's one of the reasons why coffee is often grown in highland areas. There are other reasons too that I might get into later. So this area around Mérida is a major coffee producing region for the country. It's an interesting place. I've got this little cable car that goes up the mountain, and you can look down on the city and kids playing soccer and everything. Okay, moving on, the llanos. Llanos in Spanish just means open plain or grassy area. And you can see a substantial area. The Orinoco River flows through this region. That's the most important river in Venezuela. And well, let me show you a picture of it. It's flat to some extent, but not as flat as you might think. There are areas, little hills and depressions here and there, and mostly grasslands. It's widely used for raising cattle, but it's an area of, remember we talked about the tropical savanna climate where you have a rainy season and then a dry season. So in the rainy season, this area a lot of it becomes flooded. So what seems to be open pasture land, and in fact is during the dry season, during the rainy season, this will be flooded. And so the little hills and all will stick up almost as islands out within this vast, swampy lowland. On the other hand, when the weather turns dry, then the whole area dries out. And in fact, it's more usable during that time. Use it for raising cattle. That's the primary function out here. And for a long time, it was just open range. Of course, today, fenced off and divided up into large estates. And so many countries where you have cattle production have a cultural type. The person who handles the cows, we have our cowboy out west, this individual who is independent and self-reliant. Well, the llanero here in Venezuela would be similar. If you go down to Argentina or Uruguay, then they have the gaucho, similar kind of personal type person that lives out on the range and take care of himself, take care of the animals. And as I mentioned before, these people were important, instrumental in the armies of Bolivar. That's where he recruited a lot of his soldiers. So the Guiana Plateau to the south is a large upland area, a large mountainous area, but very sparsely populated. A few centers up here along the river, the Orinoco River, but not much going on elsewhere out within these areas, fairly remote, and not really too much, at least in most of these areas to the south, in the way of, not too much in the way of mineral deposits. Typically, you find these kind of tabletop mountains, these tepuis that we talked about earlier, remnants of ancient landforms that go all the way back to the Gondwana supercontinent. Remember, they broke away from Africa. So you get these tabletop mountains, and you have unique vegetation and fauna, flora up at the top of the mountains because they're so isolated, and so organisms evolve in isolation up in those areas. Also noted for indigenous people that live within this area, one of the more famous groups, the Yanomami, and not many of them left, but they still survive within this part of Venezuela. I mentioned not much in the way of mineral deposits. Up in the northern part of this region, there are. So here's a picture of Cerro Bolivar, and it's a major iron ore producing area. In fact, a lot of the iron ore that for years was shipped to Alabama came from this area here in central Venezuela. Put it on barges, go down the Orinoco River, and then transshipped across the Caribbean into the port of Mobile. And so this has been important for Venezuela. Okay, talk about Maracaibo, the fourth region. This is the lake area up in the northwest. Here you see pictures of it. And famous for oil production. It was one of the most important areas of oil discovery in the early 20th century. And the lake looks like this, with the oil wells, the drilling rigs, and the pumps scattered across the lake bed itself. A lot of that oil is actually refined off the coast. If you've ever been to Aruba or Curaçao, you know that these islands are major refinery areas, big refineries. So they refine the oil in Venezuela, but they also take the crude out here. And so part of the reason for this sort of arrangement is the entrance to the lake. It's not actually enclosed. There is an outlet to the sea, but it's relatively shallow. So big super tankers can't come up in the lake. So they'll go ahead and ship the oil in smaller vessels to some of these refineries, either on the coast or off on one of the islands. And then it's loaded aboard larger ships for transshipment or shipment over to primarily the United States. We're the primary consumer of oil from Venezuela. And here's a big refinery on Curaçao. Areas of oil production in Venezuela include this, but also substantial new discoveries out here in the east. So the El Tigre field that's become quite significant. A picture of this from the early 20th century. Here is Mr. Gomez, I mentioned, who was the dictator. This was a time when oil was being discovered and explored. And what would happen would be the foreign corporations, something like a company like Royal Dutch Shell, would come in and they would draw up contracts with the Venezuelan government for the right to produce oil. And then there would be arrangements of royalties and exploration fees, you know, that sort of thing. But the fact is, at that time, when you drew up an agreement with the Venezuelan government, you were drawing up an agreement with this person right here. He was the Venezuelan government. And so all that money, whatever was being paid out by the foreign corporations, ended up in a Swiss bank account belonging to him, his friends, and his family. And that was just the way things worked when you had these sorts of arrangements. And not just in Venezuela, but also some of the banana republics, other situations within not only Latin America, but also in other parts of the world. And so that was what was going on. Oil production is notorious in that it creates very little in the way of infrastructure development or secondary development within a society or an economy. You don't have that multiplying effect. And the reason for that, and what I'm talking about here, is creating of additional jobs related to the oil industry. Once you start producing oil, there's very little demand for labor. And so you don't go out and then hire a bunch of local people to work in your oil field. You have a few technicians, probably foreign, who come in, monitor the gauges, watch things, and that's about it. You don't create a lot of railroads and highways and all those kind of things that might help the economy. You move oil in pipelines and on tanker ships, and those are things that do not get used for other purposes. So you don't get extra infrastructure development as you might, for example, even if a company is producing bananas on a banana plantation. Well, there you have ports, you have railroads, working in the banana field, extra benefit to the economy. It didn't happen with oil. And so Venezuela itself really didn't benefit very much from all this oil production until the mid-1900s. Here's a picture of Nixon in Venezuela. Remember that? The sparked riots down there at that time. And I mentioned Betancourt, and one of the things that he did was he nationalized the oil industry. And so everything now is controlled, operated by the Venezuelan oil company. So those benefits did accrue back to the country then at that time. And what did they do with it? Well, they wanted to promote development. And one of the ideas they had was, let's build a brand new city. And so they built Ciudad Guayana from scratch out here in this interior. Take advantage of the iron ore, producing steel. And here's where the Cerro Bolivar is. And also aluminum, generating electricity. Here's a picture, still a large industrial area. There's a picture of it. They also wanted to promote migration. A lot of people living in this crowded north central area, not many in the rest of the country, and so that was another reason they wanted to try to get people to move away. Some mixed results, I would say, not fully. Well, as time goes by, you have Chavez coming to power. Oil then gets mixed in with politics. His policies meant that the production was less efficient. He did a lot of things of social consequence, helped the poor and all. But a lot of the things that he did really limited the productivity of the production. A lot of outright subsidies. He practically gave oil away to Cuba during his period in power for political reasons. Call this special reduced rates for his friends, including China. And so consequences were not very good for the oil industry. One thing you may not be familiar with is that Citgo is fully owned by Venezuela. It used to be an American company, but bought out. Thought you might be interested in this. These are proven reserves around the world. Now, there's a difference between estimated reserves and proven reserves, but these are confirmed reserves. Number 10 in the world is the United States. Libya is 9, Russia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran. Third is Canada. Number 2, Saudi Arabia, and you might not have expected Venezuela to be number 1. More proven reserves of oil in Venezuela than anywhere else. So the country is wealthy. It does have resources, but it's essentially squandered them. Here you can see petroleum imported in the United States from Virgin Islands and Venezuela. Venezuela is the blue, and it's gone down. Related to this is the situation of the economy, per capita GDP. Income in Venezuela, one of the higher values in Latin America up until this period, mainly because of the price of oil and things going well. But look what's happened. It's gotten down to half of what it was just about 5 years ago. And simply because of the oil industry, political unrest, and so many other things. Meanwhile, here's oil production and the green bars, and are the oil revenue, and then look at the inflation rate by the line here, just going up. And this doesn't even include the current year, where things are absolutely worse. And all of this related to the problems associated with the government. A lot of turmoil.
Venezuela used to be the richest country in Latin America, but now it's falling apart. If you've turned on the news lately, you've probably seen stories about protests, food shortages, and massive inflation. So how did Venezuela go from this to this? Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, and oil exports make up over 95% of the country's income. Meaning, if it doesn't sell oil, there's no money to spend. On top of that, Venezuela hasn't been taking good care of its oil facilities, and the state-run oil company hasn't paid its subsidiaries. So these companies started producing less oil, a lot less. The oil price has also plummeted, which leads us to the next problem: how Venezuela uses its money. Protesters claim Nicolas Maduro and his predecessor Hugo Chavez ran the country to the ground. In 1998, Chavez launched a political revolution with a new constitution and socialist economic and social policies, all boosted by high oil prices. He started redistributing land and wealth. He nationalized oil, finance, agricultural and industrial companies. He fixed prices and devalued the exchange rate with the US dollar. These policies helped a lot of people, but with less money coming in, the system collapsed by the time Maduro took over. Now the country's down to its last $10 billion, of which $7.7 billion are in gold and can't be spent in a hurry. And it owes roughly $7.2 billion in outstanding debt this year. Because of all this, the country's currency, the bolivar, has lost 99% of its value in the past 5 years. So for example, $100 of currency in 2012 would be worth just 20 cents in 2017. Inflation reached an all-time high with 800% in December 2016, and the IMF estimates it will go up all the way to 1,134%. Let me visualize that. That means that liter of milk that may have cost $1 before could end up costing roughly $11 by the end of this year. In a country where 80% of people live in poverty, that's just not affordable. And it makes things especially hard if you're a country that gets most of its food from abroad. Food and supplies have become so scarce as a result of inflation and price controls, they're being sold on the black market instead of in stores. With a large part of the country on the brink of starvation, food trafficking has become the biggest business in Venezuela. So Maduro put the military in charge of managing the country's food supply. But an AP investigation found that the military runs its own black markets and takes bribes from food importers. To be fair, there were shortages under Chavez too, but under Maduro, they became even greater. So great, in fact, that 3/4 of Venezuela's adult population lost an average of 8.7 kilos in the past year. People also have trouble getting their hands on life-saving medical supplies. The country is lacking roughly 80% of basic medical supplies, leading to drastic consequences. Venezuela is in the middle of a vicious cycle of bad policies and worse luck. It's been at the top of the World Misery Index for 3 consecutive years. So then, why is Maduro still in power? Venezuela's poorest haven't taken to the streets so far. They're afraid to lose some of the benefits they gained under Chavez. And Maduro's support base goes beyond just the poor. He has the military on his side because he's been keeping them happy by providing jobs, food, and basic supplies. Empowered by the support, he's been accusing the opposition of encouraging violence and training children for terrorist groups, which is what he likes to call the protesters. Now, he wants to create a popular assembly that can rewrite the constitution, and he declared a state of emergency. The opposition is afraid the assembly will be entirely made up of pro-Maduro parties, so they're calling for new elections and Maduro's resignation. Since April 1st, 2017, 67 people have died in the protests. Hundreds have been injured and thousands arrested. Mediating the standoff will be a tough mission, even for the Pope.
Situation not good. So he held the election. Here's a graph of his popularity. Continues to decline. And a few months ago, he held the election, and essentially, very few people turned out. All of his candidates won, and so he has essentially stacked the government with his officials. And so there's no sign, or very little sign, that the opposition will succeed in overthrowing Maduro. So unfortunately, the results are not, I'm not very optimistic about the future. Okay, let me move on. Talk a little bit about Colombia. And you can see that it includes significant mountainous areas in the northwestern region. After independence, Colombia included the area of Panama that we talked about last time, and events associated with the Panama Canal led to that area being independent. There's very little contact between the main areas of Panama and Colombia. This is an area known as the Darien, and it's basically an impassable forested region. So no roads, no way of getting from one area to the other except by boat. Here's a picture of Teddy Roosevelt on one of those Bucyrus excavators. Earliest population or earliest settlement during the colonial time came in from the Caribbean side. They would come in and then move up the Magdalena River into the central part of Colombia. The interior region was where the Chibcha Indians were dominant. I mentioned El Dorado, maybe the Chibcha chief would jump into the lake. This is an area known as the Cundinamarca Basin, and initially this was the most attractive area for the Spanish. They came in, established themselves, agricultural area, and also discovered some gold, and of course later emeralds, which are a major product of Colombia. You have separate significant areas in Colombia. I mentioned the Cundinamarca Basin, that's over here, and Bogota, the capital of the country, is the largest city in this region. Another area of significance is the Antioquia province and the Cauca Valley. Cauca River runs through this area, and you see several large cities here. Cali, Medellin, Popayan, further areas to the south. And these areas are separated by the high mountains of the Andes. This central range of the Andes here is a veritable barrier that prevents easy contact between these regions. Well, historically, this has had some significance. Here are a couple of pictures of the large cities in the Cauca Valley. The Cauca Valley, the Antioquia province, ended up being more conservative, Bogota more liberal. And at some point, this ended up translating into politics. And for a long time, the dominant parties, in fact still, are the liberal and the conservative parties. It may sound familiar to us over here. But at times, this animosity, which is regionally based, but also spreads to other realms within the country, not just regionally based, would break out into violence. So the history of Colombia is one of violent conflict. A lot of it related to these political differences within the country. There was a period of time, early 20th century, known as the Thousand-Day War. Large numbers of people killed. There was a period more recently known as La Violencia, which was just protracted warfare out in the countryside, just banditry and assassinations, and you can see the estimated deaths, over 300,000 during that time. And then more recently, the activities of FARC, this guerrilla activity group, and here you can see the map here. Actually, I think I have another map I'll see. But the areas of heaviest concentration and then reduced influence in Colombia. And this is more recent, in the 1990s, early 2000s. Come back to the politics in a minute. Talk about specific areas. You have a Caribbean region, Pacific area, and then the mountains, and then lowland areas in the east. The high mountains in Colombia are the Andes, and the Andes separate into three distinct ranges. You have the broad eastern upland areas that includes the Cundinamarca Basin. The highest mountains are this central range right through the middle of the country, and then the western highlands. There's a small knot of mountains up in the north called the Santa Marta Mountains. And it's basically where this central range dips down and then re-emerges above the surface. And here you see pictures. And it's been significant in Colombia because it creates great difficulty for communication. Very few railroads in Colombia. And the roads, as you can see, going across the mountains, it creates significant problems. So many of these areas, through the early periods and all the way up to the present, have developed a good bit of autonomy and separation from each other. City of Bogota, the center of the Cundinamarca Basin, Bogota, and other areas within this eastern island, Bucaramanga, for example, are major coffee producing areas. A lot of it's shaded. Remember Juan Valdez on the commercial? He would come. There's another reason why. I mentioned coffee is grown in highland areas. Another reason why coffee is grown in the highland areas is because it creates significant value, even though significant value per unit weight or per unit bulk. And what that means is in areas where transportation is difficult, you tend to find coffee cultivation often preferred. So to grow coffee, of course the climate influences it, but it's fairly difficult to cultivate. It takes 5 years for the trees to reach full production. It has this high unit bulk per weight, and so wherever you have transportation problems, then these kinds of products that give you a lot of value per unit weight are preferred. In other words, you grow coffee, it may take you a long time and a lot of effort, but once you get a load of coffee on the back of your mule, and get it down the mountain to market, you've got something of significant value. Imagine growing sweet potatoes up in the mountains. Well, you'd be hauling potatoes up and down the mountain all day long trying to make a living. And so that's why things like coffee do well in these mountainous areas. And even better is coca. Coca is similar in that production yields a high value per unit weight or per unit volume. Up in the north, you find banana production. Up in the Caribbean region, another characteristic of the north is the influence, again, of the African ancestry of the slaves that were brought into the Caribbean. That affects the music. It affects all kinds of elements. The language in this region different from the rest of the country. Transportation into the interior was up the Magdalena River. For a long time, these two cities, and they still do to some extent, Cartagena and Barranquilla, competed with each other, competed for trade. Now they compete for tourism, primarily. Cartagena, they built a little canal that would connect their city to the big river called El Dique. Let's see here. And there's a picture of it. Comes in at Calamar. Picture of Barranquilla up on the road. These are big cities, good-sized places, attractive places. So in Colombia, you have cities in the eastern highlands, these two, for instance, and here are the populations over on the right. A couple of cities in the Cauca Valley, big cities. These aren't the only ones, but two of them, Cali, Medellin, Barranquilla, Cartagena on the Caribbean coast. So you have these different areas where you find concentrations of people. As you go into the eastern lowland, you have, in the south, you have the tropical forest, and then continuation of the llanos up here in the north with animals and things typical of that area. These are anacondas. In Florida, we have the pythons. And again, just as in Venezuela, you have the cattle ranching and so on in this eastern grassland area. Talk about coca in Colombia. Colombia's not been a major producer of coca or the plant. That's usually grown further south in Peru or Bolivia. Often used traditionally in Latin America. If you go to Bolivia, they'll serve you coca tea that supposedly reduces the effect of altitude sickness. Didn't seem to do anything for me. And of course, make cocaine. A lot of the processing, though, was in Colombia. And so and you get an association between the revolutionaries of FARC, and they're being financed by the money coming in from the coca industry, and efforts by the governments, supported by the United States, to eradicate these laboratories. And it's been fairly successful, and it's not the problem that it used to be. Mention oil. Oil, major official export from Colombia, major areas of production. And here's some statistics of the official exports from Colombia. Crude oil is 42%, so it has really become significant output, and most of the stuff going to the United States. Notice that coffee, used to be coffee would be about 60 or 70% of the total exports, not anymore. And most of it goes to the United States. Talking about FARC, this is Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. And you can see how their area, they've been pushed back by the government, primarily as a result of the efforts of this president, who is still the president, and he was fairly effective in not only military, but more importantly in negotiating with these people. Here's their main leader of the revolutionaries, and they have come to an agreement now, and so the violence in Colombia is not significant. I won't say it doesn't exist, but it's not nearly as significant as it was at one time. Okay, good stopping place. I'll come back and talk about 2 more countries after the break. So I'll give you 5 minutes and we'll get going again. Okay, let's move on rapidly. Have 2 more countries to cover here. Talk to you a little bit about Ecuador. Ecuador is part of that northern confederation of the former Spanish areas. And as I mentioned before, Ecuador, small area, was sort of in between. You had the big center down south at Lima, and then you had Bogota up to the north. And so this was a kind of an in-between area. Wasn't really producing any minerals of any value, and so the Spanish during the colonial period had limited interest here within this region. If you go to Ecuador, similar to what I mentioned about Venezuela, and buy a map of Ecuador in Ecuador, it'll look something like this. It will be a whole lot bigger than the maps we draw of Ecuador. They lay claim to large areas out here in the Amazon that they dispute with Peru. Just so happens that Peru is a stronger nation, and so for practical purposes, it belongs to Peru, not to Ecuador. A couple of individuals associated with the independence movement in Ecuador. I mentioned Bolivar. The big national hero in Ecuador is Sucre, who is considered the liberator of this region. And then, of course, established their independence from the rest of this northern area of South America. Withdrew from Gran Colombia in 1930. So it didn't take them long, less than a decade to break apart, go their own way. 3 particular areas, distinct areas in Ecuador, and this is true of several of these Andean countries. You have a coastal region, area along the coast. You have the mountains in the middle, and then the eastern lowland. Here's along the coast. This is the area around Guayaquil. Large city. Here's what the mountains look like. A lot of big volcanic peaks in Ecuador. And then the eastern province is, at this level, it's tropical forests. You're away now from the llanos of the north. This is just tropical forest vegetation, rivers running down, ultimately emptying into the Amazon as they flow to the east. There you go. That's what it looks like. The Andes are the dominant factor, the dominant physical presence in Ecuador. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of these volcanic peaks. And here you can see the mountains stretching through this area. It's an interesting arrangement of alternating areas of mountains, and then separating the mountains, you have basin areas. And the big cities that you see on the map, places like Quito, Riobamba, Cuenca, these are located in sort of basin areas with mountains, big high mountains in between. And most of these mountains are volcanic peaks. This is a very active area of the Andes. The darker red areas are volcanoes that are you would consider currently active. In other words, there's smoke coming out and they're subject to eruption at any moment. So several of them within this area. But the others are also volcanic peaks. Now, as I mentioned before, volcanic extrusion creates good soil. And so these are also favorable agricultural areas. So these basins in between the volcanoes where you get accumulations of these rich deposits are good farming areas. And that's also where the bigger cities have emerged within the region. Here are a couple of pictures. This is the highest mountain in Ecuador, Chimborazo. Tungaragua, and still active. A few years ago, that's been more than a few years, there's a group of scientists up there looking down in the cone, and it just happened that it coincided with one of these explosions, and a couple of them were killed as a result. Some concern because Tungaragua is just up the mountain or uphill from this big city, Baños. Baños, it's an area of warm baths, and people come there, tourists, heated by, of course, all the stuff underneath. Here's an image of it. Here's a mountain. There's Baños up there. And all these black areas, these are lava flows. So if they get one of these big eruptions, as could happen any moment, then you could get either a lava or a pyroclastic flow down, and it would just wipe out the city of Baños. And so there's concern. They have drills, try to prepare, but if it happens rapidly, they'd just be out of luck. Yeah, Ellen.
Is that a heat mountain?
It's infrared, yes. And these situations.
Ground is that hot?
Well, let's see. This was I'm not sure what band of the IR spectrum it would be, but the dark areas, these bluish, reddish areas, that would be high, that would be essentially black if you were looking down from above. Green is the vegetation. Well, these basin areas, as I mentioned, in between the volcanoes, are good farming areas, good areas of settlement. When the Spanish came in, they simply took all this favorable land at the bottom of the basins and divided it up among themselves. So a lot of these areas are used basically extensively and rather than intensively. In other words, used to raise cattle or horses, plant some crops, but they're not cultivated as intensively as you might expect, even though the soil is quite good. And that's because they are owned, that a lot of these areas are owned by the Spanish more for status and prestige rather than to produce something of economic value. That was, to have a big ranch was just something that gave you position in society, and you didn't care if you're making $100,000 or $500,000. That wasn't the important thing. And large cities, Quito here, for example, also developed within these basin areas. Traditional architecture. Now, as you go up the side of the mountains, you get much more intensive cultivation. So you get things that look like this. These are the indigenous people, the Indians, descendants of the Incas and others, who are living on the side of the mountain, and they cultivate these areas very intensively. And so this pattern is probably just the opposite of what you should have. Up in steep mountainous areas, you have problems with erosion and all kinds of loss of soil fertility. And yet, because these were the areas where the Indians were relegated, Spanish took the land at the bottom, and so the Indians had to go somewhere. So they moved up the mountain, and they then are intensively cultivating this for food. Whereas the bottom land, these basins, are being used, they could be used could be more productive than they are, and it's a factor, it's a result of the social structure that developed here in Ecuador. So you get growing potatoes and other stuff. You still have substantial indigenous populations within this area. They maintain many of their cultural attributes. And also, of course, overlaid on that, you have the whole Spanish culture that was brought in during the colonial period. And you have an interesting coexistence between these two groups. You would call it some strong traditional patterns of behavior where the Spanish, their relationship with the Indians today is the same as it was many years ago, and patterns of courtship, patterns of association, what you do for a living, these things have persisted. Talking about the highlands now, not as much evolution of some of these things in the mountainous areas. And of course, the Indians, primarily the economically underclass relative to the Spanish aristocracy. A lot of that's changing, though. So you find basically populist socialist movements within the country, more diversity. I mentioned Correa, who is a socialist-leaning president, advocating for Indian rights and that sort of thing, similar to what's happened in Mexico and other places as well. In contrast to the highlands, you have the conditions down along the coast. This is the big city of Guayaquil. It's named after the river, the Guayas River, that flows through this area. The Guayas River really drains a large lowland area. This is actually the biggest city in the country now. And this whole southern region right around down here is a very fertile agricultural area, but different kinds of crops from the basins in the highlands. Highlands, of course, upland, temperate climate. Down here, this is hot, warm, tropical environment. And there's Quito, there's Guayaquil. And here you see the lowlands, and what they grow is bananas. That's the big crop down in this area. Large banana plantations within this region. If you hadn't ever seen bananas, there they are. And they've been doing this from the early 20th century. And Ecuador, banana ship. Here you can see these 2 years, not much difference between the 2 years, but it gives you a comparison of the countries. Ecuador, by far the biggest exporter of bananas from Latin America. You might think Banana Republic, Costa Rica, Honduras. No, they are much smaller, much less production than what comes out of Ecuador. Ecuador ships to Japan, ships up the west coast of the United States. The operation of bananas in Ecuador, these are not the big multinational companies, not so much United Fruit or Del Monte, big American companies as you would find in Central America. These are basically locally owned companies, big scale, small scale farmers, and then they sell their bananas at the port. The banana changes hands. Unlike the industry in Central America, which is vertically integrated, where United Fruit owns the plantations, owns the ships, distributes it. Not here. Everything changes hands. So these bananas go to Europe, they go to Japan, and they go up to California primarily, not so much in the east coast of the United States.
Sonny?
Yes.
Another export, particularly around Quito, is the roses.
Oh, is that right? I wasn't aware of that.
Oh, my
Grow a lot of roses?
Right.
Hmm.
Amazing. In fact,
Thanks.
many of the roses you'll see in the stores.
Come from that area? Wow, okay. Thanks. Barbara and I were down there. I told you we were on that ship. We went down, we stopped at Manta, which is a major tourist center on the west coast, famous because it's the center of Panama hat manufacturing. Didn't know if you know Panama hats are made in Ecuador, not in Panama. And this is what they were doing all day long. These Chinese trawlers would pull in loaded with tuna fish. They would just, truck after truck. I just watched them by the hour doing this stuff. Saw one time they dumped all these fish, and there was some guy in the bottom of the truck down there. So they got covered with fish. But they're all frozen, and so it's watch that, and you wonder, well, what's going to happen to the tuna population around the globe. It's not going to survive too long. Pattern of movement has been from Quito down to the coast. That's where the jobs are, and so a lot of these traditional areas are providing migrants to this area down along Guayaquil. And so that's one reason why Guayaquil is growing, riding on the top of the train there. Okay, again, oil is produced in Ecuador, great extent. There have been some issues with the oil industry. You may have kept up with some of this. Oil is produced mostly up in this northeast area, and tremendous pollution problems, environmental destruction out there as a result of some of the policies. Chevron was involved, but they're out of the picture now. All of this is owned and operated by the Ecuadorian company. There's still controversy about all this, and a lot of court cases, and to have time to get into all of that. Can't mention Ecuador without mentioning the Galapagos, belong to Ecuador. Major tourist attraction, people retracing the voyages of Darwin and seeing the same animals that Darwin saw. But unfortunately, if you go to the Galapagos, these are the animals you see more often now. And they're absolutely devastating the native animals on the islands. Cats, rats, and goats. They're just destroying population of iguanas and everything else. So anyway, well, there's Correa. He is, and here he is. He was president of Ecuador for a long time. Here he is with Chavez. He's just been replaced by Moreno, and honestly, I don't know anything about Moreno. I don't know if he's...
Yes, from his first name.
Lenin. Yeah, well, maybe his parents had different politics. I don't know. Okay, let me talk to you briefly about Peru before we run out of time. Familiar with Peru, the Incas. Talk about the Incas, but there are large civilizations, old civilizations in Peru long before the Incas were there. And so, without getting into all of that. So here is excavation of Caral. Estimate this city goes back 5,000 years, considered the oldest area of occupation in the Western Hemisphere. Still some old irrigation structures from the Incas and beyond. Pizarro came in here with his relatively small group of a couple of hundred soldiers and easily conquered the Incas, and this then becomes Spanish. So this area then is part of all of this at one time was Peru, and then La Plata broke away. San Martin, who was from Argentina, declares Peru independent, so they broke away. Various wars, War of the Pacific, there was fighting over the northern Atacama Desert, fighting between Peru and Chile. There were some very rich nitrate deposits at a time when nitrates were being used for fertilizer. And there was actually a settlement between Peru and Chile. Bolivia ended up losing the most out of all. They lost all of this territory. Various leaders in Peru, I won't go into all of these folks. Again, alternating periods of civilian military rule. Here are some of the more notable ones. You may have heard Aya de la Torre. He was the founder of the famous APRA party in Peru. He was never president, but he was an important political leader. Belaúnde Terry, this fella, ended up in jail. And Alan Garcia, he's the only president ever to be elected by this Aprista or APRA party in Peru, even though it's been a major political force for a long time. Here's a current guy, and I don't know anything about him either. I'll try to read up and see what he's up to. Peru also includes the three distinct areas: a coastal region, highland area, and then the interior. Coastal area is quite dry, desert-like. Remember, Ecuador is very wet. A lot of warm, hot, humid weather here with the bananas. You come around this little corner here, and all of a sudden, the climate changes to desert, and it gets drier and drier as you move south. And there are reasons for that. It has to do with the ocean currents and some other things that I'll talk to you about later sometime if you want to. Here's where the people live. The darker green are the population centers. So you see some along the coast, particularly around Lima. And then also within this highland plateau area, significant numbers of people. This is what the coast looks like. This is actually down close to Lima. Lima is a large city, the capital of the country. And here you see some of the economic activities. I wanted to kind of zoom in. And what I wanted to point out is that along the coast, you see all these little green areas. You have places where streams, rivers come out of the mountains to the east, and they flow down to the coast. Well, what happens is there's very little rain here within all of this here. There's kind of a light drizzle that falls. It's called garua, but not much real rainfall. And so people then live in these areas where streams come down because they can use water from the streams to irrigate plants. And so these are agricultural, exotic. They call them exotic because they're based on these streams. And I thought I'd show you what it's like in some of these areas. Here's where the Santa River comes out. And so you see major development in the associated streams. But all this white area, this is all desert. There's nothing going on in those regions. And so here along the river, then they irrigate. But I thought I'd give you a little kind of a flyover of a place called Paramonga, which is not too far from Lima, in this region. And it's famous. There's a fort here, an old Chimu fort that was instrumental in resisting the Incas' invasion of this area. So it's something of a local tourist attraction. But I thought I'd give you a flyover. And then after I did kind of a flyover with Google Earth, I said, well, let me see if I can find something else on the internet about Paramonga. I didn't know anything about it. This is varied agriculture. You can see here, for example, they're keeping animals. But much of this is sugarcane cultivation. So you see the city, the town comes right up to the edge of the fields. Central square. Most of the economic activity is focused on this thing right here. This is the big sugarcane refinery. And then over here to the left, they're processing the sugarcane waste of the bagasse and using the fiber for various purposes. So that's what most of the people in this city do. They work on in that facility. Land owned by the company. These are all company lands. You go out, work in the fields, work in the field. So here's the fortaleza I was telling you about, the fort that was used to fight the Incas. Found one segment where some guy had flown a little drone around the city, so I thought that'd be interesting for you. Found another one where some motorcycle rider from Sweden was riding around town. I got his footage too. If you can't read Swedish, you're out of luck. And I can't tell what he's saying. But I thought I'd let you see what the town looks like. This was from a fiesta there near Sid. I'm not sure. I need to look up and see what it's about. One thing that's interesting, you look at the people dancing up front, and notice on the right, the women and the girls are dancing together, not with the boys. You go to the left, and it's the guys. Just thought that was an interesting cultural feature. They're obviously checking each other out, but they're just not, next to each other.
Si viene problemas o ataque contra mí, y yo no tengo miedo porque descuida de mí. Si viene problemas o ataque contra mí, y yo no tengo miedo porque descuida de mí. Yo tengo los operos.
Okay, so there you get it. You see what parabonga is. One of the big alluvial fans of these areas where water comes out is what was used by the Spanish for their capital, Lima, big city, big metropolitan area. Up the coast, well, of course, similar substandard housing. Major fishing area within this region. It's up the coast from Callao, which is a big port. But this is, as you get away from these alluvial fans of these areas of agriculture, this is what coastal Peru looks like. There may be some goats or a few sheep, but even those kinds of animals, there's not a lot you can do in that kind of environment. Familiar with Nazca and the designs on the surface. Don't have time to go into that, but that's down the coast of Peru. A lot of speculation about, what that's all about, including some, I guess as Von Daniken thought they were done by astronauts or aliens.
How big is that?
Pretty good size, as big as this room or more. Okay, here's another quick flyover. You can do all of this on Google Earth, which you've probably picked up I enjoy messing around with.
Is it here that they mine in the mountains and then the people who work there chew coca?
Here, and they do in Peru down near Lake Titicaca, but that's probably more typical of Bolivia.
Okay.
We'll talk about next time. Thought I'd give you a quick view here. This is El Misti, big volcano. And we're flying along here about 300 or 400 meters above the surface. No, this is, Google Earth is a mosaic of satellite imagery. So this is all based on satellite imagery, and then you can figure out the different elevations and all of that. So here's the top of the mountain. What I wanted to point out is right over there, that's another big city. That's the city of Arequipa. And El Misti is also an active volcano. So these people, they live in the shadow, just like people in Naples. By the way, who was it last time was mentioning the big potential explosion in Europe under Naples? Was it somebody in here? Anyway, there's a big supervolcano brewing in that part of the world too, that I just happened to read about the other day. Anyway, so there it is. There's El Misti. Here's Arequipa. And again, if the eruption occurs in, certain situation like Mount St. Helens, all of these areas, all of the cities are going to be in danger.
Did that happen in 85? City wiped out?
No, there was an eruption, but it didn't threaten the city. It either went the other way or it wasn't as big as it could have been.
Is there any way for them to drill vents so that to prevent eruption?
No, not really, because you're talking about it's a matter of scale. There's nothing we could do that would relieve enough pressure to allow that. Okay, well, let me just mention a few things about the highlands. Of course, the Incas occupied the highlands at Cusco, Machu Picchu. Here's Cusco. the navel of the empire. And you still see a lot of Incan architecture. We've talked about the Incas before. A lot of high mountains in Peru, big mountains. But in between the mountains, it's interesting, you have flanking mountains to the west and to the east. You have this high plateau area. So once you get up in the mountains, it's pretty easy to get around. You know, build highways and railroads and all kinds of things and travel without too much difficulty, as long as you don't try to go back down to the coast or go over the east to the end of the forest. So this altiplano, this highland plateau, is heavily populated, widely used. It's a major area of mining. Here we are on Lake Titicaca, which is the southern border of Peru. And mining is a major economic activity in Peru. They mine all kinds of things, gold, copper. This is a big copper mine down in the south. Silver, of course, during the colonial period. Historically, production from along the coast associated with the bird droppings, guano, has also been important. Late 19th, early 20th century, a lot of our fertilizer came from these deposits. The birds are there because the fish are there. And not any big fish, although I did show you pictures of tuna fish. They're coming out from further in the Pacific. Little sardines and anchovies, things like that, which, unless you like anchovy pizzas, these things are more useful for animal feed or ground up. And so that has been significant. All of this affected by El Nino, which I've talked to you before about. Periodically you have climate conditions changing. The fish are there because of the cold water, typical across this area. But when that gets replaced by warm water, the climate changes. It's not desert anymore. You get heavy rainfall. Not good. It means flooding. It means all kinds of problems. Often people are killed as a result of all of this. So El Nino is a major disruption of the climate in Peru. It affects us over here. We talk about climate in California and all, but more important in Peru. Big cities, let's see. As you go into the east, this eastern area is tropical forest. To get there, though, is the problem, because you have these deeply incised canyons of rivers, and you have canyons that are twice as deep as the Grand Canyon. And so trying to get across these areas is a major problem. And so to go from western Peru into eastern Peru, a lot of times the cheapest way to do it is to go own a ship around the Panama Canal up the Amazon River. That's, to be honest, that's what you have to do. And you get into this lowland area. Big city on the Amazon is Iquitos. This was an area I mentioned, coca production. Peru's also had its share of guerrilla fighters and people against the government, not so much lately, but up into the late 1990s, early 2000s. And most of that has been defeated by the government. Okay. Well, a whole lot of pictures in a short period of time covering substantial area, and I apologize for not a whole lot of time for questions, but I'll be happy to stay behind and talk to you if you do have questions. Thank you for being here. We'll move on next time.